right, good morning, everyone. I still see a number of participants joining the webinar, but we are going to get started. My name is Sarah Deidre Kasdorf, and I'm the Deputy Director of Government Affairs for the Wisconsin Counties Association, and I am pleased to have the opportunity to moderate our February webinar series on diversity, equity, and inclusivity. First, I want to thank each and every one of you who has joined us this morning. Discussions surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusivity can be very difficult at times to participate in and can get uncomfortable at times as well. Yet it is critical that counties begin to take steps toward meaningful discussions on diversity, equity, and inclusivity, not only as their role as an employer, but as a provider of critical state and local services. What we have put together at the association is a 4-part webinar series on diversity, equity, and inclusivity. The purpose of this 4-part series is to introduce DEI to counties and provide you with some tools to get started. This is by no means the only work we will be doing as an association on this issue, but it is our starting point. Down the road, we envision surveying counties to catalog what the state of DEI efforts look like in all counties across the state that we can then use to help identify training needs, as well as identify counties that can share with their colleagues from across the state their successes and even their lessons learned. We all have a lot to learn on DEI, but you should know that this is a safe space in which to ask questions and to learn. With that, I'm going to begin to turn it over to our presenters today. Part 1 of our webinar series is entitled Building a Foundation, the County Role in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusivity. We have 2 wonderful presenters today who are going to set the stage for us and help us understand what is meant by diversity, equity, and inclusivity, and why it is important for counties to engage in these efforts. So first up, I'm very pleased to introduce and turn it over to our first speaker this morning, Milwaukee County Executive David Crowley. County Executive Crowley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to the Wisconsin Counties Association for kicking off the Black History Month with this first of a 4-part series on diversity, equity, and inclusivity. This month, we're excited not only to honor the contributions of Black Americans, but to continue the work to focus on our priorities and really also our resources on achieving racial equity and becoming the healthiest county right here in the state of Wisconsin. We're proud to be on a path towards equity and better outcomes for every county resident. And I hope that our work can serve as an example and inspiration for how counties can contribute to dismantling systemic racism and creating better outcomes for historically underserved groups of folks. And so right now, Milwaukee County, we began our journey towards racial equity in 2019 by becoming the first jurisdiction in the nation to declare racism as a public health crisis. And we're proud that after today, more than 166 local governments across the country have followed suit. So what does it mean to declare racism a public health crisis? It means, one, that we are acknowledging the explicitly and implicitly racist policies and practices at all levels of government that have worked to the advantage of white residents and to the disadvantage of Black residents and other residents of color. And while these discriminatory policies and practices may not have appeared to have direct correlation with health outcomes, the impact along racial lines is indisputable. And these are significant health disparities for Milwaukee County residents that are along racial lines, which impacts community health overall. And so right now in Milwaukee County, we know that race is a predictor of both quality and length of life. Here, a white person will live on average 14 years longer than a Black person. According to the data from the Department of Health and Human Services, and this data shows that the infant mortality rate is nearly 3 times higher for Black infants than white infants, and at 4.2 and 4.8 deaths per 1,000 births. And this result is why we are 71, one of the unhealthiest counties in the state of Wisconsin. We rank 71 out of 72 counties across this state. And we've languished at the bottom for many years, meaning we haven't done nearly enough to address the root causes of inequities and provide the services that meets the needs of everyone, no matter who you are throughout this county. And so not only do we think that county government has a role in tearing down systemic racism and improving health outcomes for all residents of color, we believe we also have an obligation to make a change and improve the lives of all of our residents. And so we recognize that the institutional racism is a critical issue to these inequities that many people have experienced in Milwaukee County. And so last year, we followed up that 2019 ordinance with another commitment with Milwaukee County identifying different policies and eliminating policies and practices and power structures, intentionally or unintentionally, that worked in favor of some and created barriers for others in this community. And so for the first time last year, we created our first strategic plan in over 20 years to focus explicitly on achieving health and racial equity. And we have three strategic focus areas. The first one is creating intentional inclusion. We want to reflect the full diversity of Milwaukee County at every level of county government. We want to create and nurture an inclusive culture across the county, but also increase the number of county contracts awarded to both minority and women-owned businesses. We also want to bridge the gap. We want to determine what, where, and how we deliver our services to advance health equity. We need to break down the silos across county government. We want to maximize access to and make sure that we're improving the quality of all of our services that we offer, but also making sure to apply a racial equity lens when we're making decisions. And last and not least, we want to invest in equity. We want to invest upstream to address root causes of health disparities, enhance the county's fiscal health, as well as our sustainability, but also dismantle barriers to diversity and inclusive communities. And so when we think about how do we put this in practice, we did that with our 2021 budget that we adopted using a racial equity lens for the second budget in a row. And so this most recent budget, it allowed us to put that strategic plan in motion, and we hope to build on that success in the future. And so, for example, intentional inclusion, we set aside $374,000 to start to even out the pay equity issues that we know has existed in our organization, not only when it comes to race, but also when it comes down to gender. We have our Office on African American Affairs. They're doing racial equity trainings for all of our staff, and we're going to expand on the development tools that we currently have, as well as those resources. And our budget also funds an employee engagement program manager to help ensure that we are creating that culture of inclusion and engagement with our organization. We've also renamed some of our parks. We named Harriet Tubman Park not too long ago because that's what the community wanted. But when you think about building bridges, bridging the gap, this budget integrated three of our county departments, our Department of Health and Human Services, our Department on Aging, as well as our Department on Veteran Services, so we can advance the policy of no wrong door, which is we want to create easier access to quality, person-centered care, which will eventually improve customer service and as well as provide direct access to service families who need it the most, but also it will allow us to free up funds for critical services such as transportation, family caregiving support, housing, and case management. And we're doing all of these things. We created new direct service positions, an elder benefit specialist and 2 human service workers. And the elder benefit specialist is the first of its kind in our department's history, which is going to help provide Milwaukee County with a central go-to staffer who can help older adults and their families understand Medicare and Medicare savings programs. And these are just some of the exciting things that we're doing. But when we invest in equity, what we've been doing is we want to decrease the population of the youth justice facilities, and the eventual closure of Lincoln Hills is going to free up $1 million in savings so we can reinvest into community-based programs for our young people and their families. Like, for example, our Credible Message program, which is providing emotional first aid, violence interruption, and mediation. We created an achievement center to provide vocational service, work placement, apprenticeships, and job certifications, not only for our young people, but their family members as well. And all of this, just to make sure that we're moving this community forward. And so we've also created a grants procurement division to find creative ways to address Milwaukee County's fiscal challenges. Our racial equity framework has positively impacted our response to the COVID-19 pandemic as well. We were one of the very first ones when we created this dashboard to explicitly track race. And since its inception last March, we've had over 2.4 million hits on this dashboard. We've also awarded many of our CARES dollars to support community organizations identified by our Community Resilience Response Team, a group that was stood up during the pandemic to offer community-based guidance to the county's regional COVID response. And it has made individuals with intimate knowledge of Milwaukee's history and its impact on the pandemic today. But the biggest barrier to achieving our goals here in Milwaukee County, and many of you understand this, is the structural deficit that we face each year which has been created by many of the state-imposed funding limits and the growing cost of state-mandated services. So since 2012, Milwaukee County has faced a cumulative budget gap of approximately $320 million, which is an average of about roughly $30 million a year. And this is alarming because our region needs to thrive in order to remain an efficient partner, but more importantly, an efficient contributor to the rest of the state. And we know communities across this state are facing similar trends, and the problem will continue to grow. But that's why local governments need a permanent solution that removes the financial restraints that we face and provide really the tools and the flexibilities that we need so we can meet our local community needs. And the financial challenges facing Wisconsin communities are critical and widespread, meaning that they impact communities, large, small, urban, or rural. And these challenges have a tangible impact on each community. And we need to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to make sure that we have the resources to invest locally. And this problem existed before the COVID-19 pandemic, but the pandemic has really highlighted and laid bare the problems as county governments have needed to address the public health and economic challenges that we've seen be created by this pandemic. So we're going to continue to look for creative solutions to manage these fiscal challenges. But one sustainable long-term way to provide flexibility for local governments and to allow us to meet our basic local and state obligations is to utilize a local option, 1% increase in our sales tax. And this would be used for both decreasing our property taxes, but also it gives us the ability to fund our local priorities. And this idea has support in our community, and there's interest across this state. And we're building coalitions that include not only Milwaukee County, the city of Milwaukee, we have the Metropolitan Milwaukee Association of Commerce, and the Greater Milwaukee Committee has all come together to advocate for such a local option, particularly here for Milwaukee County. And this will give us the ability and other municipalities basically to go and ask our voters through a binding referendum if they approve of utilizing an increase of the sales tax to provide not only local property tax relief, but making sure that we're sharing the cost of services with visitors and commuters and investing in local priorities that are essential for our residents in a major metropolitan area. We need to make sure that we have funding for our parks, our emergency services, our transit, and our senior centers. And the support from our business leaders in Milwaukee and other community leaders have really been critical in advancing this proposal. And here in Milwaukee County, that 1% will help us generate about 160 million additional revenue in the county. And when we think about this is so we can make the types of investments that we're talking about when we talk about breaking down the barriers of racism to make sure that everyone has access. So there's a lot of room for county governments to make impacts big and small so we can achieve not only racial equity, but also health equity. And we can look at our institutions, our policies, our practices, all of them to make sure that they're fair and just for all when we serve these individuals, and that those who are in need of these services can get access. And so we can assess how government services can best improve living conditions for all of our residents and to work to deliver those services for them. And so our approach at Milwaukee County focusing on addressing the root causes of racism. And we want to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to tackle this. And so Milwaukee County or any institution can't simply flip a switch and achieve racial equity. We have a long way to go and a lot of hard work to do it. But we're making some significant progress towards our goal. And I just want to say thank you again for giving me this opportunity to talk about what we're doing here in Milwaukee County to achieve racial equity.
Thank you so much, County Executive Crowley, for those wonderful remarks. We really appreciate the time you were able to give us this morning to kick off our webinar series. We did have a request, and I will work with your staff on that, to get a list of the steps and activities that Milwaukee County has undertaken. So I'll work with your staff and we'll be sure to get those out to everybody so that counties can learn from what it is Milwaukee County has been doing. So again, thank you so much for your time today. And we hope you can continue to join us for the rest of this webinar, and we'll do Q&A for folks as soon as both speakers are done. With that, I want to turn it on over to our next speaker, Kirsty. But before I do that, I just want to mention that we are going to take Q&A at the end of the presentations, but we are going to be using the Q&A function and the chat function in Zoom to take Q&A. So at any time throughout the presentation, please feel free to please feel free to type in your questions, and we'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A throughout the presentation, and we'll be sure to get your questions asked following Kirsty's presentation. The other thing I want to mention to you guys as well is that Kirsty has some interactive portions of her presentation where we're going to ask you to respond in the chat and in the Q&A. So please, we want you guys and encourage you to participate in this webinar and input some responses in the chat and the Q&A functions. So with that, at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Kirsty Fontaine, who is a program manager in the health program area at the National Association of Counties. I'm going to dispense with reading her full bio. I think we sent it out to everybody as part of the promo for the webinar series. So Kirsty, I'm sure will talk a little bit about herself as well as she gets started. So Kirsty, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you for having me. Again, my name is Kirsty Fontaine, and I'm a health program manager at the National Association of Counties. The majority of my work really lives at this intersection of what does health and equity really look like. And I'm super excited to be able to share with you all today. As Sarah mentioned, I am a very kind of interactive kind of person. So throughout my presentation, if there are any questions you have, definitely feel free to drop it in. Amy Middleton, I already saw your question about the rural communities aspect. I'll definitely try to touch on that as I work through my slides. And just really wanted to reiterate what Sarah kind of said at the top of this discussion. Talking about this stuff can be really uncomfortable. I recognize that this can also be very personal. It hits on some of our values and some of our assumptions. So really want to set the baseline of like, this is a safe space and we are all really here to learn. I am not the expert on every single thing. So I'm sure there's some things I don't know, and I'm more than happy to do some work to help you all find the answers you need, but really wanting to establish this being a safe space and making sure that we do have respect for others. I assume that there will be aspects and areas where we disagree, but being able to do so in a respectful way is really key for jumping into this content. So with that, I will go ahead and share my screen. There we go. And I think we tried this before, so I should be in presentation mode. Awesome. Great, so kind of jumped into this already. A brief kind of overview of how we're going to structure this presentation. I know we have about 40 minutes or so. I want to make sure we have time for questions. Is we're going to do a lot of defining terms, and don't worry, don't have to write all of this down. My slides are available, and if you need any support in that, I'm happy to provide it. So we're going to be doing a little bit of defining inequities. How did we really get here? And then jump into a little more about what can counties really do, and what some opportunities and areas for kind of improvement and change may really be. So to start off, I do love this quote by James Baldwin. It says that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I think this is a great backdrop to really start our presentation talking about and recognizing the history of inequity in our country, whether it be different racial groups, sexual and gender minority groups, just different groups who have kind of suffered types of oppression and discrimination. It's really important to be, as uncomfortable as it is, to be very, to be able to really just acknowledge that, because that's the way we're going to really be able to move through. I wanted to start with examples about COVID-19, because I think it's a very kind of grounding way for us to start the conversation, given it's something that we're all really familiar with, we're all really living through it and having to navigate it as best we can. And understanding COVID-19 kind of hit all of us, right? It was coast to coast, folks were hit with it. And even in something that's so widespread, recognizing that there are those pockets of inequities and those pockets of disproportionate impact. So just looking here about recognizing that African Americans and Hispanics, I should have put Latinx folks on there actually. Latinx individuals represent nearly 20 to 30% of COVID cases, but they really only make up 12 and 17% of the US population respectively. So just recognizing that disproportionate burden just in the burden of disease. And also looking at the impact of COVID-19 on employment and income, recognizing we're kind of really navigating this wave of what is this economy really gonna look like post-pandemic, but just thinking about the economic impact that has disproportionately been placed on some of our communities of color, in the same way that some of the COVID health risks and health impacts have been a disproportionate impact as well. Another thing to bring up here, and with the vaccine rollout, we're already kind of seeing places and studies that are saying that, hey, this rollout isn't as equitable as we could have it be. So what are some ways that we can really course correct and make sure that the individuals who are most impacted are the ones who are able to get the help that they need? But also, I just realized, because I kind of have the screen up on both sides, I don't think I can see the Q&A right now. So Sarah, if you need to kind of stop me at any point, please feel free to do so if we have any timely questions coming in through the chat. So I want to jump into this slide about recognizing how do we get here, but also understanding our history. While this presentation will be mainly focused on race equity, I really wanted to bring to light the idea that all oppressions are very connected. And so as we talk through race equity, talk about the disproportionate impact and the burden on communities of color, these types of conversation, this type of framework is still applicable to other marginalized and vulnerable groups. So broadly speaking, thinking about inequity and injustice, talking about a lack of fairness, a lack of justice, and while tons of groups have really suffered these kinds of things, wanted to bring attention to the main groups that I have on the screen there, just looking at indigenous individuals, just thinking about the history of the land ownership, and looking at their communities really being persistent pockets of economic and health outcomes that have been significantly lower than the national averages and levels that we've seen. Talking about people of color and thinking about that real history of slavery. And what jumped out to me as I was preparing for this presentation was just thinking, we just got off of an election year, thinking about the Voting Rights Act and how, yes, the 15th Amendment in 1789 did kind of say, hey, all folks can vote, but the Voting Rights Act had to be signed in 1965 to make sure that that was really enforced. And when you think about that in the context of history, not very long ago. So thinking about what is the impact on a community when they were excluded from making decisions about their own community, about their own world, about society. I'm thinking about women as well, also using that voting example of recognizing the Voting Rights Act was passed in 1920. So that's still not too far, probably like about 100 years ago. And thinking within that within the Voting Rights Act of 1920, that was particularly and specifically looking at white women. So thinking about the Voting Rights Act coming in 1965 for people of color, that 45-year gap of women of color still not being able to vote. Looking at religious minorities as well, and just thinking about some of the stereotyping that leads to discrimination. And we'll talk a little bit about those pockets of stereotyping, what that really means. And also looking at sexual and gender minorities, folks who have experienced tons of discrimination and violence against queer and trans individuals, and recognizing lots of decisions are being made on their behalf without their input, without their recognition. So how do we combat that? And finally, looking at individuals with disabilities, thinking about the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed in 1990. That is, how old am I? That was not too long ago. So just recognizing in our 243 year history as a country, a lot of these advancements have been made pretty recently. So thinking about what is that impact for the foundation of the country that was made without the input of lots of women, people of color, individuals with disabilities, and some of the other pockets of truly not negative, but subpar outcomes that we're seeing that we all understand can be prevented. And so recognizing these events occurred years and years ago. I hear this all the time about like, oh, slavery happened a million years ago. Why are we still talking about it? Because its impacts are still felt and seen today. We're still living with that legacy. And going back to that first quote, unless we kind of recognize that, we will not be able to move through it in a way that really encompasses everyone's views. All right. So this is a very kind of quick question. Just wanted to take a step to slow down because I know I talked about a good amount of stuff in this last slide. Is there anything that surprised you? I think that another conversation that comes out of DEI discussions is really thinking about how we were educated as a country, thinking about the areas of oppression, the areas of discrimination that we do a really good job of glossing over. And so just wanted to quickly take a pulse and see if there was anything that was shared that jumped out to you or anything you did not expect. On my end, I think what I always react to very quickly is realizing a lot of these things happened very recently, thinking of those rights that were instated to individuals. So feel free to jump into the chat and kind of share anything that jumped out to you. In the interest of time, I will keep going, but I'll try to keep an eye on what is coming in for folks. And Sarah, again, please feel free to stop me if there's anything super notable that I should kind of address. All right, so we can quickly jump into kind of laying the foundation and defining some terms. I think we're in an interesting time where we love a good buzzword. We love to really talk about something without really talking about it. So I wanted to slow down a little bit and take an opportunity to really define what we mean when we say diversity, what we mean when we say equity, and what we mean when we talk about inclusion or inclusivity. So looking at diversity, that's kind of really the numbers game, right? Just the presence of differences that may include race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, disability, age, religious commitment, and all of those things. So diversity is really kind of those numbers and those pieces of the puzzle. Equity is really looking at how do we promote justice? How do we promote fairness within whatever procedures, processes, and how we're distributing our resources and institutions and systems. I really appreciated hearing from County Executive Crowley talking about participatory budgeting, where you're making sure that individuals who are going to be affected by the allocation of resources have a say in how those resources are allocated. And equity, a key thing there is really, you do have to understand the root causes of the disparities that we're seeing. It's not just, oh, people of color are disproportionately suffering from COVID-19. It's thinking about what are our issues with access? What are our issues with affordability? What are our issues with making sure folks can get where they need to go? So some of those questions kind of underlie that concept of equity. And finally, looking at inclusion or inclusivity. What can we do to ensure that those who are diverse and those who need to be included truly are, and that they truly feel welcomed? Inclusion program outcomes are typically met when you, your institution or whatever, you're able to really be inviting to all. And I think the real sticking point here for me is that inclusion is on the terms of that group. As a Black woman, I am not, as a Black able-bodied woman, I am not here to define inclusivity for someone of Asian descent or an individual with disabilities. I do not get to make that call because that's not the lens that I see things. So it's always very, very key to bring people to the table and make sure that they're the ones who are really able to define what inclusivity looks like for them. All right, I'm gonna pause super quick because I'm seeing some numbers come up in the chat. So I wanna make sure I'm aware of things. Yes, Corinne, yes, ADA was in 1990. Very, 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 very recent when you really think about it. Nothing really surprised, awesome. Can I talk about the difference between equity and equality? Wonderful, you were ahead of me because that is actually our next slide. So I think that this is often a place where we kind of get stuck when we're thinking of equity versus equality. So I'm gonna kind of walk through this example, which is a great way of visualizing what each of them really means. So when we think about equality, equality is a really, it operates on the premise of one size fits all, right? So that everyone needs the same exact thing, and we're going to give that to the folks regardless of their individual needs and kind of what their background is. So you can see for that first kind of panel, you have that young lady in the wheelchair. She's not really able to ride that bike that was offered. The second person is kind of hunching over. He's kind of a tall dude. That bike is a little bit difficult for him. That third person is really getting the benefit there because that bike fits them perfectly. Also looking at that last individual, super short legs, struggling on that bike. So when we look at that bottom panel, it is really about giving everyone what they need. Looking at that first individual, you're adapting that bike to make sure that they're able to properly sit there and do what they need to do. That second individual, a much bigger bike because they are much taller. Nothing really had to change for that third person because it already fit. And that is a key point of there are going to be some areas that can stay as is, but recognizing the outliers around who may need either additional support, additional resources to get to that same spot. And finally, that last person, they got him a cute little bike so he's able to ride without being overtaxed. So what I really get from this slide is one size fits all very, very rarely works. And I think that sometimes for efficiency and for expediency, it's very, very easy, especially at the government level, to really kind of pass sweeping things that really aim to address the needs of everyone. But whether it's intentional or unintentional, we are widening those gaps. Because if you look at that first panel, if this was a race, young lady, the third person, she would be completely ahead of everyone else. And everyone will still be trying to kind of get their bearings so they could continue. And so even though the provision of the bike, great idea, the fact that it wasn't tailored to folks is really what's gonna be continuously causing those disparities and those inequities. And I love the quote. I was recently able to talk to the race equity officer in Durham County, North Carolina, and a quote that she said to me was, "No policy is race neutral. Nothing we do is race neutral. Nothing we do is discrimination or diversity neutral. Everything either has an effect to exacerbate what we're seeing or alleviate the effects on those individuals. So we need to be very, very mindful of who we have at the table when we're making these decisions, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a couple of slides." I hope that answered the question about equality versus equity. So this is another graphic that talks about somewhat of the same thing, just using the analogy of giving folks boxes. So giving folks the same box, you can see in that first panel, that individual on the end still can't see. The second person can kind of see a little bit better, but it's probably not completely ideal. And that first person was already tall enough to begin with, right? So they were able to kind of get that boost, even though they may not fully have needed it. But this is what equality looks like, everyone getting the same thing. That second box is, that second panel is where they're kind of distributing things differently, seeing who really needs this, seeing that that first person didn't really need that box. And so being able to shift that over to the last person who does absolutely need to be able to see over that fence. And that last image, I really love that we're adding this kind of last frame of like, the issue here is not the people, the issue here is not these boxes. Why do we have this fence? Why do we have this wooden fence between these people and this baseball game? So thinking more in depth about justice, what are we doing to really remove the systemic barriers that we're seeing that are even causing the need for these boxes? Just another way of looking at the equality versus equity example. Before jumping into the next slide, I'm going to quickly check the Q&A. Great. We had another question about how do we get to equity equally or fairly? Hold on to that one. I will be covering some things at the end of the presentation that hopefully will get to that question. And if I do not, definitely please feel free to let me know. We'll jump right back in to that. I don't think there's anything else to jump into right now, so we can move into the next slide. Let me make sure. Perfect. So as we're talking about the differences between equity, equality, what does diversity look like? What does inclusivity look like? Something that's really important is to be able to kind of get a sense of where we are and where we're starting. And so I thought it would be great to talk a little bit about what bias is and how it shows up in the world that we live in the ways that we interact with others. So broadly speaking, bias is defined as the disproportional weight in favor or against an idea or a thing. And typically in a way that is not the most fair, maybe a little bit prejudiced. So for our purposes, we're just gonna look at these two types of biases. There are tons of types of biases, but for the conversation around diversity and race, thinking about these two areas is the easiest. So thinking about explicit and conscious bias, these are biases that you are aware of your biases. You're like, this is something that if you told me, I would completely understand. And these are things that that you can kind of point to and say, this is the decision I make. The example I typically use is, I have a strong preference for Trader Joe's over Whole Foods. I just like Trader Joe's better. I don't really love going to Whole Foods. So I'm very, very aware that that's where my mind goes if I need to get groceries when I'm in the city. Looking at implicit and unconscious biases, and this typically is where we get tripped up. These are the beliefs, the attitudes, the things that we kind of have ingrained within us that we do not know about, that we are not completely aware of how we're kind of navigating the space. And the reason this is very important is that several psychological studies have shown that up to 90% of the decisions that we make are unconscious. We love to think we're in control of our minds and the things that we do, but we are shown time and time again that for efficiency, for expediency, the human mind loves to categorize things and it loves to put things in boxes so that we can really save time. So a lot of our blind spots end up coming in this area of implicit and unconscious biases. I didn't include the link on here, but if anyone is interested, I believe it's run out of Harvard. There is the IAT, the Implicit Association Test, which is a test you can take online, and it goes through a series of groups. I believe it's race, there's something on age, there's something on gender. So you can kind of get a sense of like where you lean in terms of possible implicit associations. And what they do is they ask you a question and they ask you to very, very quickly start to make associations between words and pictures and concepts. I've taken it a couple of times, and it's always interesting to me to recognize the words I'm willing to put together and the faces I'm willing to put together in ways that if you asked me on a regular day, hey, Kirsty, do you believe this thing? I would say I don't. But it's really thinking about how are our brains and minds working without us really knowing in some ways. So this next discussion question, I hope we can get some participation on this, just thinking about, can you think of any implicit or explicit examples of bias in your life? And whether it shows up professionally or personally, obviously we don't have to make it a huge thing about race, but just small things where you're like, hey, I do make this decision pretty quickly because I have a clear idea of what I want. Or saying, you know, I didn't really realize how my assumptions or my biases were coming up in a specific place. So we'll pause for a second and give folks some time to jump into the Q&A. And we'll go from there. Let's see what's coming up. The name of the test about implicit bias was called the Implicit Association Test. It's the IAT. And if you just Google implicit association test, it should pop right up. It should be the first one there. All right, I was just looking at the Q&A. I'm looking at the chat right now. Okay, perfect. All righty. Awesome. No policy is rate neutral. Yes, I will. I will come back to that one while we're at the end. I'll put that in. But the race neutral comment was made by, her name is Joanne Pierce. She is, I believe, the director of race equity in Durham County, North Carolina. She is absolutely phenomenal. And so that is where you can attribute that quote to. Thank you for asking about that. How does each organization reach or measure and idealize inclusivity in the face of personalized self-interest? Okay, so for those of you in the chat who haven't seen this, we got a question that was talking about how to best engage the talent of an organization and making sure that, and recognizing that inclusion is a very personalized result. How does an organization reach or measure progress towards inclusivity and idealize inclusivity in the face of personal self-interest or self-bias that may influence such a measurement? This is a phenomenal question. And I think we are definitely still working through this. I think that the first thing I think about when I think about how an organization can really think more about inclusivity is making sure the individuals you're trying to include are actually at the table. We do a lot of talking for people. We do a lot of talking over people and assuming we either know what's best or what's most appropriate, but making sure if there are individuals in your organization who either are from a marginalized or more vulnerable group, bring them into conversations, make sure they're part of decision making. And I think the nuance there is not wanting to be like, not wanting to fall into that idea of tokenization where we're just reaching out to people, oh, I'm reaching out to you because you're Black, but really being willing to sit down and saying, hey, I recognize the pain points here for you may be different from what I may experience and what I may see. What is coming up for you? And in those kinds of conversations, I think it's very important to recognize how power shows up and how it can be difficult at times for, let's say I'm a program manager, it may be difficult for the head of my department to come ask me something and be like, hey, what's your input here? Because I'm still thinking of like, I'm employed here. I don't want to say anything that could possibly piss someone off and jeopardize my standing in the organization. So there also have to be discussions about how do we make sure that people are protected and allowed to bring themselves fully to a space without that fear of like retribution, without that fear of possible punishment, because they were honest and because they were really trying to jump into their self-interest. I think that a lot of these measures they have to be co-created. I think that sometimes top-down approaches, while great, are not always the best way to capture the full understanding of like what your folks need. So making sure that all measures and metrics you create are collaborative. I hope that answered that question. Some folks saying that, all right, almost calling semi-drivers he, like the very small things that we just associate with folks get struck by the assumption in media that elderly people, yes, I think that we'll talk about this a little bit in the next slide, but we talk a lot about how society plays a huge role in the ways we see ourselves and the way we see other people. It is a very known thing that the person who tells the story gets to control the narrative. So when you are not included in the telling of your own story, folks can kind of put you in whatever box they want to put you in and whatever serves their purpose. And so some of these implicit biases and ways that we things that we associate with people are genuinely not because we're bad people. Like that's always the takeaway. We're not bad people. We may be a little bit misinformed. We may have a little bit of bias in the ways that we kind of frame people. So it's really important to take a step back and recognize that. Great. So in the interest of time, I think we'll move on a little bit just to make sure we're able to get to everything. So if I can find my slides. Okay, perfect. Wanted to make sure before we moved ahead that we were able to define some of these terms and how they really play into the conversation of bias we were just having. So thinking about, these are typically the 4 different types of racism, and these were adapted from Race Forward is a phenomenal organization that's doing a bunch of work around how do we continue to have these conversations about race in a respectful and a meaningful way. They offer tons of training. So the name is Race Forward. I believe it's one word, and I would absolutely check them out. So they're defining internalized racism as racism that lies within individuals. This is kind of your own thoughts, values, and things that you kind of reside inside your mind. And the difference here with this one and the next one is this is just inside of you. Like this is where that unconscious and implicit bias comes in. And this is before it's kind of actualized and comes out. Interpersonal racism is that racism that occurs between individuals. So how are we, a lot of the things that we've seen in terms of discrimination and folks like either being violent or derogatory towards individual groups, that's interpersonal racism that typically happens between people and is one of the kind of the more harmful ones, because I think it's externalized, right? The next two are kind of those real big systems one that I think that counties play a great role in really addressing. Institutional racism is what happens within institutions. So it involves discriminatory treatment, unfair policies and practices, and inequitable opportunity based on race. So an example here is we've done tons of studies around the criminalization of Black students in schools and how for the same infraction, Black students are expelled or suspended at a rate higher than their white counterparts. Another example here is, I believe it was probably like 10 or so years ago, that study that happened where they wanted to understand whether or not there was actual discrimination in the hiring process. So they had like 2 identical resumes, but the only difference was the name. So they had one that was kind of like a white sounding name and one that sounded Black. And like we saw time and time again, that even though the resumes were identical, the white individual, the white name on that resume got significantly more callbacks than that Black name. So thinking about the internalized ways that are manifesting in a very institutional racism kind of way. And then finally, bringing it all together is structural racism, looking at racial bias across institutions and society. It's the cumulative effect and compounded effect of lots of things that come together that systematically privilege white people and disadvantage people of color. One of the examples that comes up for me here is thinking about the racial wealth gap, and how even when you control for education, there is still a significant wealth gap between white individuals and individuals of color. So thinking truly about like what's going on beneath the surface there. And the important thing about these 4 types of racism is they all kind of feed into each other. It's all a feedback loop, because when you have institutional racism, structural racism, as we discussed before with that bias piece, you start to create narratives that feed internal thoughts and internal beliefs that people have that may come out in an interpersonal kind of way. So it's a very interesting interplay of all of these systems. All right, so another question, I'm gonna jump in the chat a little, I see it kind of blowing up a little bit. So can you think of any types and examples of racism? And again, I know this is a little bit touchy, so if you feel comfortable, absolutely feel free to drop it in the chat. If not, I would just love if you just thought about it a little bit, maybe wrote it down on your end of what things have you witnessed or seen that have really played into any of these 4 categories. And while we're taking this brief pause for that, I'll jump back into the Q&A to make sure we're not missing anything. Yes, a comment in the chat was, would redlining be an example of structural racism? Absolutely, redlining would be an example of that. There are studies coming up now that redline communities still have lower property value. And this one was an interesting one for me to wrap my head around. I'm still figuring out how to understand it, but that the temperature in redline communities is actually, I believe, a certain percentage higher than other communities. And that brings in the whole other aspect of environmental racism. And I think I'll look for the article for that to send that out, because I know I cannot speak fully on environmental racism, but I just thought it was very interesting. If redlining, which happened years and years and years ago, still grappling with the effects today. All right. This question is, one of the critiques I hear in such discussions is the idea of confusing equal opportunity with equal outcomes with equal opportunity. The difference, I suspect, challenging. Can you speak to this important issue as a way to overcome obstructions in such a discussion? Okay, so the question is really about, and Bruce, if I don't get this right, definitely let me know. It's about people confusing the idea of equal outcomes with equal opportunity. Yes, okay. So some folks really equating equal outcome to equal opportunity and not realizing that some of the things that kind of underline, even though that outcome looks the same, the amount of effort and what needed to be overcome to get there might be different. That is a very, very good question. And I think the something to consider in that kind of a discussion is thinking about how can we make sure that opportunity is actually equal? Because I think that's what we need to get to more of the time. How do we talk about opportunity being actually equal? And thinking about equal outcomes, we often get into this place of exceptionalism, right? So we'll look at Oprah and be like, oh, she's a really educated, well-to-do Black woman. Clearly Black people aren't suffering because Oprah made it. And so we get into conversations about exceptionalism. So it really then comes down to like, so what did she have to overcome to get there? And did her peers have to overcome the same types of things? So really bringing it down to how can we reduce the barriers to increase people's opportunity? I hope I got that question fully. If I didn't, please feel free to ask a clarifying question. Women of color, yeah, structural women of color make up less than 2% of physics bachelor's degrees. And I think this comes up a ton, just thinking about STEM, science, technology, engineering, and medicine, math fields, how there's significantly fewer individuals of color in those fields. And when you bring the conversation back, it comes down to What does that pipeline look like in high school, in middle school, in elementary school? Are they being routed to class? Are they not being routed into AP classes? Are the structures needed to help them succeed in AP classes not there? Are they not being given those opportunities at those earlier levels that makes it then harder to catch up later? Great. Thinking about institutions, how they can work to reduce barriers. We're still living in a world of significant barriers. We feel like we have to do so much work to break them down. Absolutely. I'm wondering if an example is when we hire, our policy attempts to be inclusive, but we don't get a lot of diverse applicants. Yes. So we get this question a lot about, specifically around recruitment, and that idea of like, well, the applicants just aren't there. Like applicants of color aren't there, women aren't there. So how are we being asked to be inclusive when folks aren't there? And so my answer is always, 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 you're not looking hard enough. You're not looking hard enough. And not in a you should be trying hard. No, yes, it's in a you should be trying harder way, but recognizing you have to get more creative to reach out to those applicants because of the barriers we're talking about, because of like, are you making sure that we are, that you, if you're hoping to hire more Black applicants in a specific field, are there specific trade schools or universities in your area that you can build relationships with so you can create that pipeline from that institution? Sometimes just posting stuff on LinkedIn, Indeed may not get the hits that you want it to, just because these might be a little bit more niche communities that you're trying to reach out to. So being intentional about the anchor communities, anchor organizations in your community that really are able to give you access to those communities as well. I also think a thing of like, I do not like the idea of just reaching out to folks because you want things from them. So how do you, in the absence of needing something from someone, how do you build that relationship with, whether it be a historically Black college or university, or a Black church, or a woman-owned business? How do you build those relationships outside of a need for diversity? Because you truly want those businesses, you truly want those places to know that you are there for them and that you all can have a symbiotic relationship. I hope that answered your question. Do I have any sources or organizations that I would recommend for a county to evaluate where they are in DEI? I think I might, my last slide, I do kind of go through some resources and examples of places that you can tap. So hold quick for that one. And in the interest of time, I think we will start rolling. And these questions are great. I'm really excited about how interactive you all are being. So I really, really appreciate that. Okay, jumping into this next slide, I will actually rush through a couple of these because these are on a website that I'm actually going to be sharing with you all, but want to talk a little bit more about like, how can we bring this to action, right? We talked a lot about the conceptual, what's going on, how do we make this an actual thing? So I was really, really excited to know that I would be presenting after County Executive David Crowley from Milwaukee County. I think that they have done a great job of really identifying like, what are the areas for opportunity and growth here, and having the difficult conversations of, we rank 71 out of 72 right now. Why is that? Let's get to moving on that. So these are just some examples of ways that counties have been able to jump in and really try to understand better, like what is going on and how can we change the way we work to make sure folks are being included and folks are being represented. So this is just an example from Baltimore County talking about creating a diversity, equity, and inclusion employee advisory board that really, hopefully, really speaks to how the government makes decisions and how they're applying an equity lens. Durham County, I mentioned them before, they just announced their first racial equity officer who was able to come in and really talk about embedding efforts across all county functions. I think that sometimes when DEI work starts off, it's really, really easy to be like, oh, that's that work over there. Like someone else is dealing with DEI, but it is really important to make sure that DEI is embedded in your budgeting practices, your recruiting practices, your retention practices. How are you looking at help? How are you looking at employee benefits if we're looking at an organizational sense? So just making sure it doesn't kind of get pocketed as something we're doing on the side. And finally, looking at Ottawa County, Michigan, they've created a kind of DEI office that leads the development of an equity plan. And I wanted to stop on Ottawa County, Michigan really quickly, because there was a question in the chat about how do we talk about DEI when we're speaking about rural communities, communities that maybe have a like high homogenous population of like white folks and like maybe don't have that race equity component just yet. In addition to Ottawa County, Michigan, I also wanted to highlight Eau Claire County, Wisconsin, which are kind of navigating some of the same things. And it is really important to be able to apply equity where it fits. So thinking about maybe the issue isn't race equity right now, but are you seeing issues with health equity? Are there issues with geographic equity in terms of access? Are there issues with transportation equity? So can folks get to where they need to get? Are there issues with economic equity? So even if you may not have the faces to what you're looking through, thinking about where do the numbers not match up? And this really comes down to having accurate data for the county and looking at, I think aggregate numbers are great. Aggregate numbers definitely serve a purpose, but you often gloss over pockets of inequity, pockets of disparities, because you're not really able to look at the full picture. So just wanted to make that point of rural counties, you do have a role in this conversation too. It just may take some finessing of the message and moving it into, are we talking about age equity? Is it gender equity? Is it economic equity? And changing the conversation just a little bit. All right, we'll skip this question just because I know I'm gonna go over, I apologize. So we'll jump really quickly into what does sustainable DEI look like at the local level? So again, you all have these slides, so don't feel like you have to write all of this down, but DEI is really, really about making sure we're able to humanize individuals. I think that often when we get caught up, it's really about numbers, it's really about getting things out the door, but ultimately we are dealing with people and we are hoping to improve the lives of people. Wanting to make the point that DEI is not partisan. Diversity, equity, inclusion is not partisan, and for DEI to be sustained in a jurisdiction, in a county, in a state, you need the commitment beyond just like terms. You need it beyond a term limit. You need it beyond just like, oh, this person was in office and they championed this. How do we continue this going regardless of who's in office or regardless of what's going on? And that last point about making sure you're creating space for those impacted by the inequities to tell their own stories and be engaged. I know I probably said it 4 or 5 times already, but people need to have a seat at the table. The individuals you are trying to support, you're trying to help, absolutely have to be a part of the solution, because you're not coming in and fixing things, you're co-creating solutions together. This quote is really just about community engagement and ownership, and really making that point of bringing folks to the table and making sure they have ownership of what's going on too, because that's how you really get that sustainability piece. When people feel invested in an initiative, in an opportunity where they feel like they can truly bring their strengths to it as well. And finally, this is a quick rundown of some principles that folks can use. And this is mainly in the space of health equity, but this is from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and thinking specifically about COVID-19. What are the elements that that local leaders can really dive in on to be able to make this point of equity? So the point I made before about making sure your data is disaggregated by age, race, gender, all of those things, so you can really get a good understanding of what is happening in those groups. Again, including in decision-making those individuals who are most affecting and allowing them to co-create benchmarks for progress with you. This is often a little bit difficult because when we're in either government or academic spaces, we have a very clear idea. We love a logic model, right? Like we have a very clear idea of what progress looks like. And sometimes for some of these softer issues, it takes a reworking of what does impact mean to you? What is an outcome to you? And allowing those other voices to come in and soften some of those metrics that we often hold ourselves to. Establishing and empowering teams, like I mentioned before, proactively identifying policy gaps and thinking about that aspect of nothing is really race neutral. So what are the places where we may be inadvertently widening those gaps? And finally, just continuing to invest in infrastructure. I think COVID-19 is really highlighting the ways that our social services essentially hold us up. So how can we make sure, pandemic or not, that our essential workers, that our individuals who work in health and human services, that are individuals who work in our social services have the infrastructure they need to foster that resilience. Again, we'll jump through this because we are a little bit over, but wanted to quickly talk about local government and federal advocacy. I started with the example of Milwaukee County and recognizing tons of jurisdictions across the country are kind of establishing those ordinances, those resolutions or declarations declaring racism a public health crisis in light of COVID-19, and how that often is able to trigger some, whether it be budgetary or opportunities for them to be able to invest in a more systemic and a more direct way. So we love to see that happening. Wanted to quickly bring attention to Montgomery and Douglas County kind of doing the same. And again, we have a complete list of the jurisdictions who have implemented declarations against racism as a public health emergency on a website I'm about to share with you all. So you'll have that information. If you all are thinking about doing something similar or kind of want, hey, I don't know how I would frame this, there are great examples up for that. And wanted to quickly flag a NACo resolution. So at the National Association of Counties, we with our members, we develop a policy platform. And one of our platforms, which was one of our resolutions, which was adopted this year or last year, it's 2021, last year in July, was that broad goal of understanding that racism is a national public health crisis and really talking about the issues of communities of color being impacted disproportionately, and specifically asking the federal government to recognize that racism is a public health crisis, talking about leveraging a racial equity lens in evaluating federal policy as it comes out, thinking about developing more relevant policies aimed at improving the health and well-being of those communities, and finally, supporting state and local and federal initiatives that advance social justice. So that's kind of what NACo's part of the pie is doing. So we always love to hear from counties as they're engaging in this work. So definitely, as you have examples or things to share, definitely feel free to send them my way. And wanted to quickly wrap with some of the resources that I have mentioned before. Again, that first link is that NACo page, the resources for DEI. So the list of resolutions is there, as well as the examples that I pulled for the county level. RWJF, Racism and Health, is a great article kind of talking through like what it's looked like in COVID-19. It also includes those elements that I mentioned, that the health principles for local leaders. County health rankings and roadmaps, actually based out of Wisconsin. I think it's University of Wisconsin. They do a great job of disaggregating data and really getting to the nitty gritty of like what is going on in specific groups. So I would absolutely check them out and kind of see where your county ranks in some of these indicators. And finally, the last three, Government Alliance for Race and Equity. They are phenomenal in terms of understanding kind of the constraints that counties and jurisdictions really face in dealing and addressing race equity. So they are great about providing specific resources of how to like move through difficult conversations. How do we talk about this on a local level? And finally, the last two are just more links that you can kind of find out, like more information on race equity, more work on what's being done. So I urge you all to check these links out. And again, if there are any questions for me, absolutely reach out. I'm sorry I went over a little bit, want to be mindful of time, but I really, really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk to you all. And if there are any pressing questions, I'll turn it over to Sarah to see if we even have a time for that. But really appreciate you all having me today.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. That was just a wonderful, wonderful presentation. We have been taking copious notes and making sure that we have copies of everything that was put in the chat and put into the Q&A, because we know that we went over time. Obviously, it's clear we're going to have to bring Kirsty back for some follow-up for us as we continue to do our work in this area. But I will follow up with Kirsty as well as the county executive to make sure that we get answers out to everybody who registered for the webinar, to some of the questions, maybe some of the comments that we were unable to get to during this live presentation. I think, Kirsty, you actually, I think as you went through, you answered an awful lot of the questions. We're getting lots of great comments back, thanking you, saying bring you back. So that's absolutely wonderful. So I don't know, Kirsty, if you're seeing any question that you really haven't addressed quite yet, Otherwise, I know we are very short on time. I do promise we will get back to everybody. So I do want to thank everybody for joining us for today's presentations. We really appreciate your sticking with us a little longer. And I want to remind everybody that next week we will be talking specifically about racism as a public health crisis with Paula Tran-Inzio from the University of Wisconsin Population Health Institute. And then on, on February 15th, we will hear from some folks on getting started, moving from words to action, to get to some of those questions. How can we get these conversations started within our county? And then on week 4 of this series, February 22nd, we're going to talk a little bit about Wisconsin County efforts, focusing on La Crosse County and how they've been working for 13 years with their community partners on diversity, equity, and inclusivity issues. So with that, Kirsty, again, thank you so much. We'll be sure to follow up with everybody. Thank you guys again, and we'll see you back next week.